Welcome to Celebrating Canada, our CKPG News Canada Day special. Thank you for joining us. I'm Chris Chacon.
I'm Camille MacDonald. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll have a series of truly unique Canadian stories with a Northern BC twist.
And I'm Rich Abney. Sit back and enjoy as we visit with some of our oldest communities, with some of our residents, and even with our smallest train.
Canada has come a long way since the Confederation of 1867. 149 years later, we have a lot of history to look back on and to be thankful for, and we can only imagine the hardships the First Nations and first settlers had to endure when moving their families to northern BC.
Luckily, there's plenty of reminders of our historic past right here in northern BC. For example, the fort in Fort St. James or the gold town of Barkerville in the Caribou.
Just off the Fraser River and close to the Continental Divide, there's a century-old farmhouse. The HUBLE homestead is now a regional park. It has a story to tell.
40 kilometers north of Prince George lies an important connection to the past and the future. The HUBLE homestead is a regional park where lies a century-old farmhouse. It's the oldest building in the regional district of Fraser-Fort George with a distinct style.
He built it on this ridge above the river and painted it bright white, so everyone coming up the river could see this big beacon of a house sitting up on the hill and know to stop here and come in.
The location of the farmhouse and its outbuildings are strategic. During the early 1900s, there were still many prospectors looking to hit it rich in the Klondike, fur trappers and traders looking for inventory, as well as the railway arriving. The Fraser north to the Giscombe Portage was the shortest route.
Al Hubble put his homestead right where we are today because we are the beginning of the Giscombe Portage Trail. So when people were traveling up north for things like gold and furs that they were looking for, they wanted to travel in the rivers. There was no highways at the time, so the rivers were our important transportation links.
Hubble and his partner Ed Seebach capitalized on the route by opening a store where they sold a variety of necessities to those traveling north up the river or from the east. Hubble operated a bed and breakfast as well as transportation through to Summit Lake. He was a surveyor for the railway and acted as a depot for construction supplies.
Hubble was often here on the homestead, running the general store, trading with people on a day-to-day basis. They would bring furs in and he may trade for supplies that they would need for traveling, or if they were settlers in this area, then they had things like coffee and sugar and sort of the basics for your home.
It was a really kind of a neat space here in that it's almost like a little town, but based around one core family. But in the summertime, they could get hundreds of visitors coming through in the season.
What is perhaps the best link to the Hubble homestead and its recreation are the detailed diaries that Al Hubble kept from 1909 to 1919 on the homestead. Many of the entries speak of the day-to-day life on the farm and are a great snapshot of what life was like, from the birth of his children to the crops that were planted.
It's a really unique story and not at the same time. It is unique in that we have so much information about it all in one place, and we have the building, and we were really lucky in that when the society was developing, many of the Hubble children were still with us and they were able to give us first-hand accounts of what it was like living here and the things that were happening. But at the same time, they were just your average family.
The interesting thing about it is that there's so many different facets of history that you can talk about from this one place. So we can talk about women's history, we can talk about economic history, we can talk about agricultural history, First Nations history, the gold rush.
In the 1980s, the Hubble home was about to be moved and used as a cold beer and wine store in Prince George. This led to the creation of a Homestead Society and eventually a heritage designation. It is the only remaining original building on the site and has been restored on the inside to what it was like 100 years ago.
This is a really important part of Prince George's heritage, not just because it's about the Hubble family, but because it allows you to see into the lives of everyone who lived here.
Catherine HANSEN, CKPG News.
Prince George has a long history dating back to before Simon Fraser and his crew of explorers arrived in the 1800s.
As we just saw, the Hubble homestead played an important role in establishing Prince George in the early 1900s. With the establishment of the city in 1915, even more people came into town. Some of those communities are still around, while others are just a memory.
And for example, many of you probably don't know Cottonwood Island used to be called Island Cache. Or do you know what the VLA stands for? Well, many of these neighborhoods have a lot of history to their names.
The Miller Addition is one of the city's quaintest neighborhoods, and its moniker is the direct descendant of a quirky fellow, Charles Vance Miller, a lawyer from Toronto. His will, for instance, was the oddest of them all.
Of course, his most famous one is amounted to the Great Stork Derby, where he left his entire wealth to the woman in Toronto who could have the most children in the decade following his death. So it's considered one of the most unusual wills in the world and went all the way to the Supreme Court.
He came to Prince George to make money another way. He bought the contract to provide general mail delivery in the Cariboo. He later expanded to Fort George upon learning of plans by the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway to come through the city. There was a dispute over the lands.
Over a long court battle and so on, the Grand Trunk decided to give Miller a part of the land that they were buying from the native people. So that's what the Miller Addition is all about, is the chunk of land that was given to Miller by the Grand Trunk Pacific.
A stroll through Cottonwood Island Park sometimes reveals the unexpected. Apple trees and lilacs in the oddest locations. That's because what is now called Cottonwood Island Park was actually a residential neighborhood. About 600 people lived in the cache, as it was called.
If you were from the cache, it meant it came with a certain stigma, right? And it was known as a rougher area, you know, it was a working class place, but people also said that it created community in that regard as well, because everyone was faced with the same stigma of being from the cache, right?
I believe it was 1973 that the city finally took over Cottonwood Island. And over a period of time, they gradually moved the people out because it was flooding. Every year there'd be floods in there, but some years were particularly severe and people had their house washed away and everything else.
The majority wound up in a new neighborhood, the VLA.
Next to the island cache, the next lowest housing market or low-income housing market was in the VLA. So literally what you saw was a transplant of the island cache residents over to the VLA.
It's an acronym for Veterans Land Act. Passed on July 20th, 1942, it gave Second World War vets a chance at owning property upon returning home. With only a small down payment, ex-servicemen could purchase land with the help of a government loan. By the 70s, many of those original homeowners had moved on, and a good number of properties became rental units when the island cache was cleared out.
So the VLA, like the island cache, was outside of the city, so it was outside of the zoning and building regulations.
So the next time you stroll through Cottonwood Island Park, the VLA, or through the Miller Addition, remember the rich heritage this city has. CHERYL, JAHN, CKPG News.
We'll take a break now, but when we return, we'll see how a Syrian refugee family is adjusting to life in northern BC.